Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to this virtual and in-person service of the Idaho Falls Unitarian Universalist Church on this 22nd day of January 2023. We know you come here for different reasons, to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. If you are watching online, please sign into the chat box so we may know who is attending. And it will enable you to send your joys and concerns. I am Ron Goen, and I will be assisting Reverend Kevin in the service this morning. For announcements, I think the main one is after the church service will be the congregational meeting, after everybody has a cup of coffee downstairs. And also, please, silence your phones. Whoops. And please write your joys and concerns on slips of paper back in the corner. And now, let us prepare ourselves for worship. Calm your hearts and your minds and our breathing. Breathe deeply in and out, listening to your breath as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. Now we'll have the prelude. Our church's covenant helps us remember why we are a part of this faith and why we give our time and our resources to this congregation. If you so choose, please recite along with me the covenant that this congregation has chosen to live by. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now we will light the chalice, accompanied by the words from Sean Trapp. Our chalice reminds us that the fire within ourselves is the same fire that illuminates the universe. It is our reminder that all is connected, even though the space of the void is vast, and our experience here is but a blip in the cosmic timeline. This flame is our promise that in our smallness and our short time on this earth, that we may live intently and deeply with love for one another, with honesty and integrity, to be guided by rational thought and critical thinking, and with a sense of shared responsibility.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from Stephanie Kaza. We live by the sun, we feel by the moon, we move by the stars. We live in all things live in us. We eat from the earth, we drink from the rain, we breathe of the air. We live in all things live in us. We call to each other, we listen to each other. Our hearts deepen with love and compassion. We live in all things live in us. We depend on the trees and animals. We depend on the earth. Our minds open with wisdom and insight. We live in all things live in us. We dedicate our practice to others. We include all forms of life. We celebrate the joy of living, dying. We live in all things live in us. We are full of life. We are full of death. We are grateful for all beings and companions. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 360, Here We Have Gathered.
Here we have gathered side by side, circle of kinship, come and step inside. May all who seek here find a kindly word. May all who speak here feel they have been heard. Sing now together this our heart's own song. Here we have gathered, called to celebrate days of our lifetime, matters small and great. We of all ages, women, children, men, infants and sages, sharing what we can. Sing now together this our heart's own song. Life has its battles, sorrows and regret, but in the shadows let us not forget. We who now gather know each other's pain. Kindness can heal us, as we give we gain. Sing now in friendship this our heart's own song.
Good morning. This morning's Time for All Ages is titled Blue Goose by Nancy Tafuri. A story of cooperation. When Farmer Gray was away, Blue Goose, Red Hen, Yellow Chick, and White Duck decided to paint their barnyard. Very plain barnyard there. White Duck painted the fence white, and Yellow Chick painted all the flowers yellow. Red Hen painted the barn red. Blue Goose painted the roof blue. Blue Goose and Red Hen poured blue and red together to paint the doors what? Purple. Red Hen helped Yellow Chick mix red and yellow to paint the shutters orange. Blue Goose and White Duck painted the sky light blue. Then Yellow Chick and Blue Goose made green to paint the grass and the trees. What about the sun? Cried Chick. They thought until they helped Chick reach up to the sky and paint the bright yellow sun. What about the tractor? Cried Chick. Red Hen painted it just in the nick of time. It's finished, shouted Blue Goose, Red Hen, Yellow Chick, and White Duck. The barnyard was filled with color. They were ready to say, "Surprise!" to Farmer Gray. And when it was time for bed, what did Blue Goose do? She painted everything blue, except for the moon. The end.
As we leave this friendly place, love give light to every face. May the kindness which we learn light our hearts till we return.
I'll read the joys and concerns, and Reverend Kevin will light a candle for each of these. From Pam, welcome visitors Christine and Joel, Seth and Scott and Ralph. Please welcome them. And Emily. And from Layla, Karen Croft had to send her dog, her cat, Casper, on his way and is heartbroken. Please send her compassion in your thoughts. From Kat, my aunt is in the hospital for surgery, I believe gallbladder. So please keep her in your thoughts. From Pam, Vic Allen is in the hospital at Ermac, not well enough to receive visitors, but can receive text. And I also will have one from Vic here in a minute. Bambi, a concern. My boyfriend's parents are very traditionally Christian, and I have a want to come out as a transgender to them so they'll stop calling me she. However, I'm extremely nervous to do so, and would appreciate any prayers that it goes okay. We'll keep her in mind. Amanda has joy. Number one, my graduate degree was finally conferred earlier this year. Number 2. That's great. Number 2, my birthday is this week, and I'm still alive. From Victoria, a joy and a concern. See if I can sort these out. All who are ill, Judy Stanley recovering from a bad flu, and Anita Carpenter. And I believe this is a joy. My new knee can ski for an hour and a half. A miracle. That's great. Okay. And then I have directly from Vic. It has been just over a year since my transplant, and while there have been setbacks, overall my life and health are much better than they otherwise would be. I would ask everyone in the congregation to consider being a cadaver donor if you are not already. The positive difference you can make to several individuals and their families are immeasurable. And from Karen Croft directly, please light a candle of sorrow for my little fur baby Casper, who crossed over the Rainbow Bridge this week. Are there any additional joys and concerns on the chat box? None. We'll light one additional candle for those joys and concerns that have not been expressed.
Our reading this morning is from the book The Web of Meaning by Jeremy Lent. The entire story of evolution on Earth, it seems, could be understood as variations on the theme of cooperation. Prokaryote genomes forming the first eukaryotes, which partnered with ingested mitochondria to boost their energy. Bacteria sharing the tools of their trade to adapt to anything that comes their way. Eukaryotes unlocking the intricate, complex secrets of genetic expression to become multicellular. Organisms blazing their own trails but never ceasing to rely on each other for their flourishing. Where then does competition fit into this picture? By now, you may be convinced that the gene's supposed ruthlessly selfish drive to replicate is not the sole explanatory factor of evolution. But surely competition has nevertheless had a significant part to play. What about all those spectacular nature documentaries showing cheetahs sprinting to catch gazelles, male chimpanzees fighting rivals for sexual dominance, bacteria that make us sick by overpowering our immune systems? There's no question that ruthless competition has a central role to play in the drama of life. How can we reconcile pervasive competition with the forces of cooperation? Let's imagine a spectrum with extreme competition at one end and extreme cooperation at the other. We can think of an organism as an ecosystem where the different parts have agreed to coexist at the cooperative end of the spectrum. The extreme commitment to cooperation made by the cells becomes stunningly clear when you consider that they voluntarily kill themselves when they are no longer needed for your body's healthy functioning, a process called apoptosis. When they make this decision, they don't just call it quits and decompose. In a careful choreography, they instruct their genes to create a crew of enzymes that meticulously cut the large molecules of DNA, RNA, and proteins into bite-sized pieces, which are sorted into little membrane packages and fed to neighboring cells. Outside the organism, however, relationships exist all over the spectrum. An ecosystem can be understood as the emergent creation of organisms acting together in different degrees of competition and cooperation. In fact, the creative tension that arises from the confluence of competition and cooperation is itself a driving force of evolution. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. For most of human history, we looked at the animals and plants around us and believed they were the same as they had always been. It is understandable that we should do so, since even several human lifetimes is far too little time to witness the evolution of a new species. Human beings have always been born, lived, and died within a brief snapshot of time in the multi-billion-year history of life on Earth. If, for example, you were one of the Clovis people living here on the Snake River Plain a mere 13,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, the geography would have been essentially the same, but it would have been a very different experience. The animals you might have encountered then would include some species familiar to us, but also many large mammal species that are now extinct, such as mammoths, mastodons, camels, short-faced bears, dire wolves, saber-toothed tigers, and giant ground sloths. Seeing a herd of bison is very impressive, but imagine seeing a herd of 12,000-pound mastodons wandering through, pursued by a pack of hungry, 7-foot-long dire wolves or saber-toothed cats. That was a different time. And for various reasons, those creatures did not survive into modern times, though our own species, Homo sapiens, continues. Clovis people, like all humans, had vivid imaginations, and so I'm sure they wondered about where they came from and how they were related to the sacred and to other creatures. They imagined creation myths, as humans have done for tens of thousands of years. Creation myths filled with beautiful stories that sometimes contain pantheons of deities or magical beings. But nobody, until the last couple of centuries, conceived of a story of life evolving from countless generations of species that no longer exist, changing in subtle ways over billions of years into the species we see today. Rather, the life around us was thought to be fixed in form. As it says in the book of Genesis, for example, created each according to its kind. The idea of one kind of species being transformed over time into another through a series of advantageous adaptive traits seemed preposterous before Darwin came along with his famous theory of evolution and proposed the idea of natural selection as the mechanism for evolution. Darwin did not know about genes and mutations within DNA, of course, but he was a careful observer of nature who recognized how advantageous traits could be passed from one generation to the next. And he speculated correctly that this is how a population of one species might evolve into something new. Darwin's concept of the fitness of a new evolutionary trait was whether it was beneficial to the adaptation of the species to its environment. He did not actually use the phrase survival of the fittest, which has become associated with his theory. That phrase was first used a few years later by Herbert Spencer in 1864. It is unfortunate because the idea of the survival of the fittest has painted evolutionary biology and its social and moral implications as a perpetual competition for survival between species and between individuals ever since. What more recent science is revealing is that cooperation between species and individuals has been at least as important in the evolution of life on Earth as competition, and probably more so. And this could have profound social and moral implications we would do well to consider. Though there has been pushback against the theory of evolution since it was first published, largely from religious conservatives, the scientific community was quick to accept it. Research in evolutionary biology and genetics has continued to validate the theory and produce proof of the processes that have driven evolution, beginning from a cluster of large organic molecules and evolving into single-celled creatures and then to multicellular organisms of increasing complexity and diversity. Biologists can now observe population-level genomic shifts in DNA that occur within a single generation, giving a glimpse of natural selection at work, even in human DNA. For most of the educated world, evolutionary biology is now simply a fact, though we humans still largely behave as if we have a special right to the planet, showing little concern for the rest of the web of life, a willful ignorance of how truly interdependent we are. After Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and others like Herbert Spencer helped promote and popularize the theory of evolution, the somewhat distorted idea of life as an ongoing competition for survival, the survival of the fittest, became a popular justification for social inequality that fit nicely with the zeitgeist of that age of unfettered capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. Spencer developed this idea into his theory of social Darwinism, arguing that the laws of natural selection not only applied to the biological evolution of plants and animals, but also to the evolution of human societies, social classes, and individuals. The strong flourished and held power, while the weak were simply the losers in the competition for survival. It was a great way to justify the neglect of the poor and the oppressed as just nature's way. Needless to say, the rich and powerful from the Gilded Age through the fascists of the 20th century found his theory to be very appealing. No need to worry about values like compassion and justice. And could there be a better philosophy to support capitalism and free market economics than the survival of the fittest? Robber barons like J.D. Rockefeller certainly liked the idea. It is worth mentioning that it was the dislike and fear of social Darwinism that motivated William Jennings Bryan to become involved in the famous Scopes trial in 1925. Many opponents of evolution were afraid that removing humankind's special status as created in the image of God would destroy the foundations of their beliefs and bring the rest tumbling down like a house of cards. But for Bryan, who was a devout Presbyterian, it was not so much the biological science of evolution but the moral implications of social Darwinism that he reviled. How could he hold to his Christian beliefs about suffering and compassion, caring for the least of these, if the philosophy of social Darwinism prevailed? Though my own moral understanding of the universe is grounded in a different source than Brian's, I can appreciate his dilemma, and I share his disdain for social Darwinism. There are at least two problems with social Darwinism that immediately come to mind. One is that the biological processes of natural selection are simply too ruthlessly indifferent to apply to a society when moral values are considered. There are always layers of creativity that are beyond the chemical and biological processes of evolution to consider. You really have to be sociopathic to believe things like preventable suffering is acceptable or that nature takes care of mistakes by birth. Abhorrent human behavior, such as slavery, genocide, and eugenics, could also be justifiable as merely the strong exercising their rightful power as the so-called winners in the survival of the fittest. The second problem is that what we are learning about the role of cooperation in evolution negates many of the assumptions about the elusive role of competition, the exclusive role of competition, and the justifiable dominant status of the strong over the weak. We are learning about the incredible complexity of ecosystems filled with plants and animals and remarkable cooperative relationships, pollinating insects, interspecies communication networks among plants, and unique symbiotic relationships between bacteria, fungi, and other life forms, just to name a few. The Earth's biosphere is proving to be a far more complex system of systems than we used to think. And some scientists have even suggested that we should think of it as a single living superorganism they have named Gaia. These days, social Darwinism has largely fallen out of favor, but in his book, The Web of Meaning, Jeremy Lent makes a strong case that the essential idea of the survival of the fittest has been repackaged in recent decades after the 1976 publication of Richard Dawkins' popular book, The Selfish Gene. Dawkins' hypothesis, which has found acceptance among a variety of audiences, boils down to a gene being the ultimate driver of evolution as it seeks to ensure its own reproduction. The organism, even a human being, is largely irrelevant. As Dawkins writes, this gene's selfishness will usually give rise to selfishness in individual behavior. Much as we might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts that simply do not make evolutionary sense. Needless to say, this is a grim image of life that is stuck in the competition mindset. And its emphasis on selfishness was a great fit for the greed is good mentality of the 1980s. Just like social Darwinism affirmed the worst aspects of free market capitalism and social inequality. According to this thinking, some genes must be evidently blessed with a capacity to accumulate obscene amounts of wealth at the expense of everyone else's genes in order to pass their genetic material along. Looking at the offspring of some billionaires, I think it easily negates this theory. Nevertheless, the idea of genes, and more specifically our DNA as a whole, as deterministic drivers of who we will become as human beings, is still championed by many in a variety of scientific disciplines. It has become a popular metaphor to see us as mere machines which operate according to the instructions of a genetic program. But we have learned in recent years that DNA sequences do not behave in predictable linear ways like a computer program. Even below the cellular level, we are comprised of components that interact in incredibly complex, nonlinear ways with networks of feedback loops that we are only beginning to comprehend. It is truly amazing. I can't help but be struck with awe when I stop to think about the tens of trillions of cells in each of us that cooperate constantly to maintain our lives as human organisms. And many of these cells, such as the helpful bacteria that help us to digest food, are not even human. Competition is part of the story of evolution, but cooperation is proving to be a critical component as well. It is best to think of them as tandem forces working together, sometimes in tension. One of the leading new theories developed by the biologist David Sloan Wilson and E.O. Wilson, who died at the end of 2021, is called multi-level selection. It is based on this dynamic tension between competition and cooperation at different scales of life. The latest thinking also suggests that mutations in genes are not the only drivers of evolution, that organisms and even populations of a species play an active role. Traits can be passed to future generations that are beyond genetic. A good example among humans is culture, and there is evidence of cultural transmission in some other species, like the famous chimpanzee study by Jane Goodall. As we learn more about the role of cooperation among species in the development of life on Earth, and discover an increasing number of symbiotic relationships that we are only beginning to understand, we have an opportunity to fundamentally change human perceptions about nature and the interdependent web of all existence. Jeremy Lent asks us to consider the following. What if our mainstream media and commentators began using metaphors about cooperation and symbiosis in place of the selfish gene? What might happen if we applied this new understanding of nature's harmonic dance to establish different norms for our own society? Imagine if, instead of our socioeconomic system constructed on the presumption that the economy of nature is competitive from beginning to end, it was structured instead on the basis of symbiosis, an ecological civilization. Competition in nature exists, and it is often uncomfortably red in tooth and claw. But we need to move beyond seeing everything through a Western lens of dualities in opposition and competition. There is a great harmony that exists in the world, and it is celebrated in many spiritual traditions, from Taoism to Native American spirituality, that envisions all forms of life as relatives in an interdependent web. Some people see evolution as heading towards some kind of destiny or mystical omega point, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin described. But I personally think there are too many possibilities to even speculate about such things. No matter what, I believe that we will continue to discover cooperative relationships and feedback loops that we never envisioned. And it will become almost impossible for human beings to deny our place within an interdependent web of all existence. I can't wait to see what nature reveals next. I invite you once again to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn, number 134, Our World is One World.
Oh, let's see. Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
Our closing words are from Susan Griffin. We know ourselves to be made from this earth. We know this earth is made from our bodies. For we see ourselves and we see nature. We are nature seeing nature. We are nature with a concept of nature. Nature weeping. Nature speaking nature to nature. The red-winged blackbird flies in us in our inner sight. We see the arc of her flight. We measure the ellipse. We predict its climax. We are amazed. We are moved. We fly. We watch her wings negotiate the wind, the substance of the air, its elements, and the elements of those elements, and count those elements found in other beings, the sea urchin's sting, ink, this paper, our bones, the flesh of our tongues with which we make the sound blackbird, the ear with which we hear, the eye which travels the arc of her flight. And yet the blackbird does not fly in us, but in somewhere else, free of our minds, and now even free of our sight, flying in the path of her own will.
Please join me in reading the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the despair of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.